right, so I'm here with Tom, and Tom is with the Rhizome House. Before we get started, how about Tom? Why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So, I mean, without getting too specific, obviously, I live in Cleveland, which is where the Rhizome House is. I've been involved in anarchist politics for over 20 years, starting out in the late 90s, like Nazi punching days, and all the way up till now. And
Yeah, I was there too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been through it, so I've been around for a good long time at this point.
Yeah, yeah, and everyone should be aware. We probably already talked for like 40 minutes. So
Yeah. Well, and if people want to know about that late 90s era, there's a new book. PM Press just put out a book on anti-racist action,
awesome.
which was written by a lot of the people that were really involved in ARA in the late 90s. And so people should check that out. That's like an
I
awesome
know.
resource.
I'm wondering if I met you at a show or something at some point because we've been
That's
talking.
possible. It's possible.
Awesome. But, okay, so um, how did I come into contact with Tom? It wasn't the 90s and some show we were at though. It was um, I came into contact with you during doing some research for another project that I'm working on about anarchists and anti-fascists aiding or directly involved in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's an important topic. There's, of course, a lot of misinformation and conflicting political positions in the left that we've kind of already talked about. But specifically, it was an individual, Cooper Andrews or Cooper Harris Andrews, who traveled to Ukraine to actually engage with in combat against the Russian invasion. Solidarity collectives, along with many other anarchist, anti-fascist, mutual aid groups, posted about Cooper and the international volunteer fighters who were killed in combat by Russian soldiers. And Cooper has connections to the Rhizome House, which brings us full circle and how we started chatting. So I was able to get in touch with you. We're going to talk about the Rhizome House, and from how we've been talking so far, we could probably have multiple discussions about that. But really, so on the website, right, it says Cooper Andrews, a friend of many in the community,
Mm-hmm.
along with a memorial fund. This is a big one, and we'll just see where it goes, But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
can you kind of tell us about who this person was, who Cooper was, and
Mm-hmm.
how was he related to the Rhizome House, or whatever you want to discuss, anarchist politics in general, Ukraine, etc.
Yeah. So, we met Cooper, uh, I think the day after the Cleveland police murdered Tamir Rice.
All right.
For those of you that don't live here, that situation, that kind of conflict, political conflict, has shaped pretty much everything that's happened in the city since then, right? Everything refers to this. Everything is about how do we prevent, police violence like this again, right? And Cooper came into our lives the next day. So that next day, the day after the cops murdered Tamir Rice, there was a march down the highway, shut the highway down, marched down to the rec center where Tamir was killed, and then into essentially the front door of this radical bookstore that a bunch of us were running like 10 blocks away from the Cadell Recreation Center, which is where Tamir was murdered. And Cooper and a bunch of people essentially didn't leave for like 2 months, maybe 3. They just stayed in the basement and organized demonstrations day in and day out. We had, police sitting outside the space, following people. I mean, it was chaos, right? I mean, there were so many protests going on in town at that point, that NPR used to have a protest update on the traffic report every single evening because every single day someone was blocking roads somewhere.
Right.
And Cooper was a part of that, right? Now in Cleveland, that campaign was at its height for like 10 months. I mean, people were moving for a very long time and still in a lot of ways haven't stopped. And so a lot of the projects that exist in the city have a lot of longevity and a lot of the people have a lot of longevity. And so Cooper comes up in that context, right? It's a city where people don't move often. And so a lot of the radicals in town are from here. And a lot of us have known each other for some time. And if we haven't, we build these long-term relationships, right? And so Cooper enters our life around Tamir Rice being murdered. And just, I mean, I don't even really know how to describe it. He just kind of became part of the crew, right? Like we just sort of adopted him. And he was working at this print shop that we were running and like publishing house and bookstore. And around, you know, the time when the bookstore project was sort of starting to fall apart, Cooper told me he was joining the Marines, which I thought was a interesting choice, especially for a black man and an anarchist from Cleveland. It's an interesting choice to join the Marine Corps, but you know, he was doing this to learn the skills that he needed to go be a fighter internationally. I've talked to his friends, his friends from childhood, and this has always been something he's talked about. I know as long as I knew him, this was always something he talked about. That internationalism was a really core part, not just of politics, but like who he was as a person. And I think in a lot of ways, who a lot of this community is. It's not an abstract internationalism. We were talking about this before we recorded, but
yeah,
the city of Cleveland takes in a lot of refugees. When I mean a lot, I mean thousands. I think we took in 4,000 people from Ukraine, right? Like lots and lots and lots of refugees. And the idea is to take this city, which has been largely depopulated by the failures of capitalism, and turn it into a global haven. So we grew up in that context. Like I grew up next to Croatian war refugees from the war in Bosnia, right? And so wars become very, you know, wars, crisis, famine, all that stuff becomes very immediate when you grow up in an environment like that. You can't sit there and just be like, oh, well, this government's fighting this government and leave it at that, because now you have to look at the person next to you in the face as they tell you about how their family's house was burned down by Serbian nationalists, right? Like it ceases to be abstract, right? Calls for solidarity from places like Ukraine or Syria become very, very, very real in a place like this, especially because even in the middle of that conflict, we are meeting the people that make those calls, right? From those communities that are asking for our help. And so there's a huge refugee assistance campaign here. There's, you know, big international solidarity campaigns. And so we grew up in that context. And so when the war in Ukraine broke out, Cooper had kind of talked briefly about going to Syria for a little while to go fight ISIS with YPG. Ended up staying in the Marines. And when he got out, he went to go be a forest firefighter, like out west, Colorado, and then Texas. And then he comes back home right about as the war is starting to like pick up, right? So we're talking like early summer. And he's like, I'm going to Ukraine. Like there wasn't a question. The first time I saw him when he got back from being a firefighter, he told me he was going to Ukraine.
right.
He had already made the decision, right? And it was just a question of figuring out how to get over there. And that took a lot longer than making the decision, I think, for him.
Yeah.
The decision was really obvious for him.
Right.
And a lot of it comes down to, you know, we have this discussion locally, and I would discuss this with Cooper a lot, but, you know, there's this problem in leftism where there's this tendency to demonize people that are asking us for help, right? We saw this in Syria, right? Where all of a sudden we couldn't help Syrians because they were all Islamists, right? And you saw this from like the pro-Assad types, right? We see this in Ukraine, right? This is the whole Ukrainians are Nazis trope. Right. And what it's there to do is to prevent us as autonomous social movements from intervening in those conflicts. That is very specifically what that narrative is an attempt to do. So what do people do in those situations? They rely on NATO, right? And that's also not great. People shouldn't be relying on NATO. Like NATO political expansion is not a thing that should be a good thing, right? And so what is the alternative? And the alternative is us. It's us intervening. It's us becoming the internationalist resistance. It's us being willing to take these exact kind of risks, right? That's what we would talk about a lot of the time. So he was going over there to build the internationalist resistance. I mean, he didn't see this necessarily as a fundamentally different conflict from Syria, right? This was about the global fight against authoritarianism. And both of the people he was killed with had fought in Syria. Like they were both fighters for the YPG, right? So there is a world there that exists now where internationalist resistance is a serious conversation. You know, it's not an idea or some sort of pipe dream. It's a serious conversation where people are really talking about what does it look like for us to intervene in these conflicts so people don't have to rely on something like NATO, right? He was going to experiment with that, to help figure that out, right? To help be part of that solution. Because somebody's got to, and he just felt this kind of calling to do it for it to be him. So he went.
Yeah, I think that, on its face, I can see, and we talked about some how he being there was reported, briefly, albeit, but in pretty mainstream media in the West. But of course, everything that you just said was left out. It was just, U.S. Marine fights in Ukraine, to build their alternative, self-serving narrative too. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important for people to kind of understand that concept of people kind of know direct action, and mm-hmm. internationalism or solidarity, like we were talking about off before we started recording, at least at one point seemed to be in the center of discussion, and now, not so much. And geo-global politics has kind of, taken that over, or at least, shares that center stage in the broader, whatever you want to call it, left or left adjacent, et cetera, mm-hmm. politics. But that idea of, having international solidarity, but also combining it with direct action too, yeah. To talk about other possibilities or other options, whether it's combat or other things, not mm-hmm. combat related, I think is really interesting. And it's, to me, it's a discussion that's very worthwhile, and something that I'm not, and it could be, depending on who you listen to, but at least in popular, let's say broader leftist media, not something I'm hearing a whole lot about, right?
No. Yeah.
And
it's because it's a complicated discussion, right?
Yeah.
Like
yeah, exactly.
Everywhere that people have gone to engage in this kind of work. I mean, we can even go back to Spain. I mean, like, seriously, sure. We can go to the Russian Revolution, right? In Spain, anarchists fought under the Republican government, right? They were part of the Republican government. It was a complicated situation. There are no perfect solutions, right? In Syria, I mean, I had friends who were American anarchists calling in airstrikes from the American Air Force.
Right.
It's strange, right? It's strange. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that conflict is never simple, right? And conflict creates complications, right? It breaks up certainties, it creates crisis and disaster, it creates complications. And lots of different groups of people have a lot of different reasons why they would flood to a war zone, anarchists included. Now, in our case, that tends to come when people from that place ask us. So when the war broke out, we were asked by anarchists in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia to donate money and help out as we could. Nobody asked people to go fight. Cooper made that decision on his own. Anarchists from over there are perfectly comfortable doing that fighting, right? But they asked us for help. And the response was, oh, those aren't real anarchists, from a part of the community, right? Yeah. It was atrocious. It was atrocious. These are individual people. And I know in one case, very specifically, there was an anarchist unit of the territorial defense that was defending the town that one of the people in the unit was from. And it was in northern Kharkiv, and they were able to fight the Russians off. But like during the invasion, okay, so individual people are asking us for help, right? And Cooper answered that call. I mean, that is fundamentally at the end of the day what internationalism is about, right? People in this case were asking for our assistance in a situation of extreme state violence, right? A military invasion is extreme state violence. And there were people that were willing to reject that. It seems absurd to me, right? But that position only comes when we abstract away conflict into these big generalities. We talk about states and coalitions. We cease talking about the actual people that are getting bombed on the ground, right? Yeah. Again, when you grow up in a city full of refugees, that is what conflict looks like. The people that are getting bombed on the ground are your neighbors now. There is no distance. And so, he felt very motivated by that. And in a lot of ways, again, this was about undermining Russian imperialism, right? I mean, this was part of the project. For if Russia loses this war, it really creates a lot of motivation for governments not to invade stuff. It realigns the calculus of asymmetric warfare in such a way that invasions become unsustainable, right? And that on a geopolitical level is really important, but that's only very much part of why he was going there. He was going there to help build the internationalist resistance as the alternative to things like NATO, right? So when people ask for our help, we can actually respond and show up and be the people that need to be the people in that place at that time, right?
Yeah.
Anarchism has become a lot more international over the last 20 years. I mean, we always talk about internationalism, but like in a practical way, it's become a lot more international in the last 20 years. And that has involved things like raising money to help get people out of Afghanistan when the Taliban rose to power, or helping supply anarchists involved in street protests in Sudan, or stuff like that, right? So this community has grown, to encompass resistance movements in Myanmar and things like this, right? What we are doing is building the capability to be able to intervene internationally, right? And that, in some ways, is one of the most important projects we can undertake, right?
It is, and it complete, and we were talking about this before too. When I was more engaged, when I was younger, like as a teenager with direct action, protest, things, digging up ditches and logging trails and stuff. That was the norm in conversation of, direct action, and mutual aid, but internationally, in solidarity with all peoples,
Yes.
Facing whatever forms, whether it's state or informal, social, religious persecution. And it seems, and we can talk about why or what have you, but it does seem like, at least on social media, but I think it's true in real life as well, with real people, that's no longer the case, and it's been replaced with geopolitics, really. And I have the ideas. I think 20 years of foreign war can do that when you grow up in that type of environment, to where we were saying kind of campist ideologies can creep in. But I don't know. I was going to ask you to kind of talk about that. The idea of even dismissing the very people that you just described, who I innately feel like we should find solidarity with, as perhaps even excuses, right, for humanitarian intervention warfare. Excuses for NATO to invade, excuses for the West to spread its imperialism. And I have things to say about that, and I think it's a little complicated, but I don't know, what do you think about that? Because I'm sure people come into the Rhizome house, especially younger people, and talk about this. How can you support Ukraine when the U.S. is sending them weapons, right?
Campism is a simplistic reductionistic understanding of a really complicated world. I mean, we were talking about this before we were recording, but campism, or in a more specific form, Marxism in the United States, like really comes from the attempt of the Soviet Union to manipulate the global left, right? They sort of used this narrative of everything against America is good as a way to excuse away Stalinism. I mean, that's literally why this narrative was created. I mean, you see the response to that in groups like the Situationists International and even the Autonomists, who were like, whoa, wait a minute, we can't just support this, and started looking at what does anti-capitalism look like without the Soviet Union, right? But that was a response to campism and the attempt to push campism. And so the world today is an incredibly complicated place, right? Not just incredibly complicated, but incredibly dangerous. I've talked a lot to older friends of mine about this, and there's this sense in which globally you see a rise of stability politics, right? You see this in Russia, right? We were talking about this, like in Russia, that calculus is actually really overt. Like if you actually pay attention to what Russians actually say, right? And at the beginning of this war, I spent about a solid year reading up on post-Soviet Russian history, just trying to understand how, for example, we were so convinced that much of the Soviet Union collapsed when there was actually a lot of continuation of how things functioned, right? It's not just that it evaporated, a lot of those norms continued, right? And so this idea allows us to take this very complicated world in which capitalism has failed us, right? In which American hegemony, which had been the sort of stabilizing force, has collapsed, right? In which there are rising conflicts all over the world, in which the climate is changing to the point where it's starting to threaten our existence. Sure, people look for certainty, right?
Yeah.
You see that in Hungary, right? You see that in Trumpism. You see that in groups like the PSL, right? And you see that in campism. Like, these are all ways to sort of construct meta narratives that allow for the world to be understandable and simple.
Yeah.
Now, in the process of that, what we end up doing is we end up, as radicals, acting on a world that doesn't exist.
Right.
Right. We end up engaging in this game of abstraction. Yeah, where we debate these sort. I mean, how many times on Twitter has someone been like, "How do you suppress the proletariat after the revolution?" What does that question even mean?
Yeah,
it is
we were
a
laughing about
pointless question, right? Like, it means literally nothing. It's essentially asking, if we assume the historical commonality of all moments and the singularity of economic classes and the singularity of revolutionary moments, then therefore, what does one do? It's a ridiculous question. It's a ridiculous question, right? But that question involves positing an entire universe of ideas that you're positing is very certain, right? It's not like it's a question that just emerges out of nothing. That question makes sense in a context, right? Very specifically in that question, it's Maoism. All of these are narratives of certainty. So is InfoWars, right? Yeah. So is someone like Nick Fuentes, right? Or, Richard Spencer in a different way was this. And you see this in groups like the Proud Boys too. I mean, these are all attempts at grasping for sort of a metapolitical or metaphilosophical certainty, right? To create some sort of fundamental grounding that one can say this explains the entire world.
Yeah, right? Yeah. It seems contradictory. It's interesting that such a abstraction could provide certainty, but it's kind of like what we were saying, right? Like, you don't need a conspiracy to critique global capitalism per se, right. And if you're using one, then you have to question, why is the person relying on something like that? And I think when you get to these levels of abstraction, it might not be conspiracy, but it's still, like you're saying, it's not getting Narcan into a backpack and going out to a homeless community bayou and actually doing something, So that distinction is interesting. The abstraction's interesting, and there are some things that will be coming up. I'll just say that to where we can look at how those abstractions can really turn things on their heads and get you defending things that you really shouldn't be defending, right? That you wouldn't walk into a room and say, I'm defending the invasion of a country or this or that, because when you get yourself into a position like that, I think we have to kind of reassess what it is that we're doing.
I think I said this to someone at the beginning of the invasion. I'm like, at the point in which your politics doesn't allow you to fight against genocide, you should probably be looking at your politics, not the question of genocide.
Right. When you're more concerned about the definition of genocide, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the fact that there's just a population of people, being abused and subjected to torture and death by a government. When you're more concerned about that and how that relates to representation in Western media or something, then it's like, well, what are you doing?
Yes.
And what are you doing it for?
And it's interesting when I talk to friends and comrades over in Ukraine, and over in that part of the world. One of the things that they've sort of leveraged consistently during the conflict is this resentment that they have against a lot of Western leftists West-splaining Ukraine to them, right? Just like this idea that these people in the United States can center America in this entire discussion of a conflict that's happening, 7 time zones away from the Eastern Coast, right? In a situation that they don't understand, in a place they've never been. It's an absurdity, right? Now, could you imagine for a second during the Iraq War, if people would have sat there in the anti-war movement and been like, resistance to the invasion is wrong, and the Iraqis should just give up and let the Americans just occupy the place, it'll be fun. Like, that person would have been laughed out of the room, right? That person would have been laughed out of the room.
Right. You're only escalating the conflict by self-defense.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it is an incredibly abusive understanding of the world. I mean, it is a form of political abuse. It's a form of saying, at the point in which we fight back, now all of a sudden if the person we're fighting back against does not like America, our repression is justified.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. It's denying the right to self-defense.
Yeah,
That's what it
yeah.
is. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's denying. And if we really want to look at the core of something like police abolition, right, or the core of a world without the state, self-defense becomes fundamental. Right. Self-defense and community defense become fundamental. And so to deny people that ability seems like a really strange position for people who also often consider themselves abolitionists to take.
Right. Yeah. When you move that into other spaces, it immediately doesn't sound right. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and it gets a little too abstract, but it's just it's anecdotal. It's something that that I've seen. But like what you said, whether, I mean, honestly, whether it's benevolently expressing some conspiracy theory, or maybe more assertively saying this is what Ukrainians should do, and it's really from just random people on social media all the way up to the academia class, in the West. I mean, it very much does sound, at least folks saying these things, it sounds as someone who is socialized in an imperial society. And that they're projecting, even though they're critiquing that society, they're critiquing it through the prism and sphere of someone who grew up in an empire, and that's how they view the world and how the world works. And
it's sort of strange when you think about it that way. Like, I was 6 when the Berlin Wall came down, right? I was like 9 when the Soviet Union fell. The Cold War was not a part of my life, right? And I live in a place that was on the nuclear target list, but the Cold War was not a part of my life at all.
Right.
It seems very strange in a vacuum for those norms to emerge again, right? Because that is what's happened, is that the political categories of the Cold War have been reimposed into what is now a far more complicated discussion than it might have been at the time. And even at the time, things like third worldism drastically simplified the complications of what was going on, right? And so the only way that we can explain that is if we can look at this commonality between sort of authoritarian and conspiratorial tendencies, in which we see the rush to certainty, this rush to stability, this rush to a certainty in politics, and that crosses anything within that sort of red-brown sphere. I mean, you see that everywhere. It also is the basis of Putinism. It also is the basis of someone like Erdogan's politics in Turkey, right? And it was the foundation of Trumpism in a lot of ways. So stability is really the politics that's being articulated in these contexts. It's a stabilization politics, and therefore a policing politics. It's not a politics of complication. It's a politics that intentionally attempts to eliminate complication. The problem becomes, if complication is our life, right?
Complication's reality. Yeah.
To drastically simplify the world is to police everything. And so that is why that stability politics tends towards authoritarianism really directly. And there's not much of a gap often in the claims of like a Maoist who is saying, because again, Marxism is supposed to end with the withering away of the state, supposedly, right? Ha ha ha. But that's the idea. And then but there's Maoists online, like in the PSL, being like, we always need the police to do this and that and stability and blah. That's not communism. That's just stability politics, right? That's so what you're bringing up the late 90s. I think what was really interesting in the early 2000s, say after September 11th, is a lot of us were critiquing the stability politics of the security state at the time.
Sure.
And we were saying this idea of security is fundamentally undermining any kind of autonomy that we may have, right? That it really implies the policing of every single moment of every single life in this space. To have what we call security. And so many of us would opt towards autonomy instead of security. And many of these people that are now arguing for stability politics fell on that side of the conversation. Interestingly enough, right? And now they're arguing exactly the opposite. It's funny to hear people call themselves revolutionaries but argue for stability, right? I always find that really entertaining.
Yeah. And something, honestly, I mean, something that folks might not even be aware of, everything from color coding, terrorist threats, to changes in transportation. I mean, it fundamentally change everything, including how you can protest and where you can protest.
Yes.
It is interesting that people would fall on one side of that and then come out on the other in the modern day.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, it's the United States is unique in being an imperial force that, you know, it's existed for a while, and this is particularly unique probably because Russia was the counterpoint to that. I stopped here because it's roughly in the middle of the talk and I'm about to switch up topics. So stay tuned for part 2 where we conclude the talk. Remember, check out the description for any links, subscribe, share, do all that stuff to get this out there to new viewers and ears. Thanks.